So welcome everybody to this joint session of the Haifa Center for Mediterranean History, headed by Tzur Shalev and Gil Gambash, and the Forum for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, um, organized by myself and Ayelet Lange. Well, and we are very pleased today to have with us Jessica Goldberg. Before I introduce her, I just want to mention that the invitation just went out. Next week, the Department of Jewish History at the University of Haifa is going to have a conference at Merkaz Chadarim, at the center of Haifa, dealing with Jews and objects. So if you got the invitation, you're all welcome to join. It's going to be hybrid on Zoom and in person. Okay, so Jessica Goldberg is the Associate Professor of Medieval History at the University of California, Los Angeles. She studies the medieval history of the Mediterranean basin, Latin Christendom, and the Western Islamic world, specializing in economic and legal history, including institutions, geographies, and cultures that govern material life. Professor Goldberg has published books and articles on the history of medieval trade, businesses, and industry, epistolographic culture, and the idea and practice of law in medieval societies. Among these, I will just mention one of my favorites, her book, Trade and Institution in the Medieval Mediterranean, the Geniza Merchants and Their Business World, that came out at Cambridge at 2012. And I have studied immensely from it, especially the way she connects text, practices, and economic history and the material world. Her current project, of which this talk is a part, explores the nature of economic change between late antiquity and the Middle Islamic period in North Africa, especially focusing on changes in economic materiality that shifted patterns of production, transport, and consumption toward increased use of textiles. This year, she is working in Israel as part of the research group on cultural brokerage in pre-modern Islam at the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies. The title of our talk today is Business Mail, Understanding Everyday Writing in the Medieval Islamic World. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Mika. And I want to just start off by thanking everyone at Haifa for helping make this talk happen, as well as express my sorrow that I still can't be there in person, but I really hope to get there before this academic year is out, or my academic year. Luckily, the Israel Institute lasts until the end of June. I also want to apologize for a technical matter. Technology in COVID times is limited, and I'm at home because I have a better screen setup, but I still am going to have to look away like this for much of the talking part to make any of this work. So please, you probably won't notice, but I apologize for that in advance. The other thing I will say is that there are pieces of this that some of you have heard, and I am trying to address two different audiences, both people who are specialized in the Islamic side as well as the European side. So both of you will feel undoubtedly that in certain cases I have radically overgeneralized. So what I actually am going to focus on today is what mercantile materials. Oh, let me start. I'm going to start screen sharing. Let me do that. Hold on. Let me find the right screen. Always a challenge. And then, okay. All right, sorry, I still have to reorganize screens because otherwise the world makes no sense to me. Okay, I think I've made this all work. Okay, sorry about that. So there's my title, and it's all gonna work. Okay, so basically what I'm going to be doing today is focusing on some of the things that mercantile.
Jessica, if you wanted to share a screen, we don't see your screen.
Oh, it's still not shared. Darn it.
I started by saying that this is a co-hosted event, but in Zoom practice, co-host means a different thing. So you're a co-host? Fine. Great. Now we can see it.
Okay, now you can see my, okay. So there was a slide that gave the title of my talk, but there's my title, but doesn't matter. So what I'm going to try and do today is focus on what mercantile materials in the Geniza tell us about some systems of written communication and really the interlocking changes in documentary production that lowered the costs, the relative costs of both literacy and long distance communication, and how this in turn shaped both understandings of the values of writing and the practical norms that governed how people created documents. Now, I'm going to start off by apologizing also that as an economic historian, I will occasionally be using economic terms. And one of those is the term path dependency. And in general, I will say I'm not a fan of arguments from economists about this concept. That is, path dependency is the notion that a set of choices in a perhaps distant past can make change difficult, even when it would be more efficient in the present. But I do think in this case, it can be useful as a way to think about historical change that involves cascades, that is, series of interlocking changes that not only shape practice, but condition people's expectations. And in the case of literacy, I really think it is worth thinking about the intertwining economic and cultural changes of such cascades to begin to really apprehend the degree of difference. And I want to emphasize here, I'm talking about scale, the degree of difference between everyday literate practice in Western Europe in the Middle Ages and the Islamic Mediterranean that starts in the early Middle Ages. And then again, I want to think about how long such differences persist and how even today such differences shape the way historians and particular economists and economic historians think about the meaning of literacy. So, and in fact, the genesis of this paper lies at two European endpoints. The revolution in documentary production that took writing mostly out of the hands of the laity in the Carolingian era, and the incredible costs of getting information around continental Europe some 7 centuries later in the 16th century. And I choose the 16th century because it is a period where we finally have a lot of information about such things, but it is also just before a number of early modern regimes undertook creating and subsidizing postal infrastructures in earnest. So, as someone who trained and actually teaches primarily in European medieval history, I found myself shocked when I was teaching Fernand Braudel's classic, The Mediterranean. After delving into the Geniza, I seriously rolled my eyes. It just seems impossible that the cheapest rate for an overland courier service, admittedly over the Alps, but between Venice and Nuremberg, which is about 700 kilometers, was 25 florins and double that for express. And it could still cost a ducat for the 100 kilometers from Venice to Ferrara, both in the Flat Po Valley. Now, I've tried to delve into some more modern scholarship on this topic, but the haul is rather small and recent studies seem to suggest rather similar amounts of money. Now, the reason I rolled my eyes is in the 11th century, sending a letter overland by overland couriers. So again, we're comparing apples to apples here, overland and overland. Cost, and that's about 2,700 kilometers, so nearly 4 times as far, cost between 1/2 and 1.5 dirhams. Now, I don't want to delve into details of relatives values, but let's recall that a florin or a ducat is a gold coin of roughly similar value to a dinar, and that the standard bookkeeping exchange rate between gold dinars and silver dirhams was 30 dirhams to the dinar. Thus, by back of the envelope estimation, it's costing nearly about 1,000 times more to send information overland in the European 16th century than in the Islamic 11th century. And as most of you will know, inflation is not the answer. And I have to say, no, it still seems completely ridiculous to me, and I can't believe it. And I'm waiting for someone to write more, give me more data. But really, how and when did such an astonishing degree of difference emerge? And how has it been so little noticed? And so this led me to really think about a couple of things that I want to do. I want to give you an outline of the pieces that make up the revolution in everyday literate production in the Islamic world, really here focusing on more recent work, much of it by colleagues of mine in documentary as opposed to literary sources, and how these massive changes, this series of pieces changes and sustains a written communication that is very extensive and rather inexpensive, and compare this to what happens in Western Europe. And then I'm going to delve a little bit more deeply into some of the material aspects of change in the Islamic world to think more carefully about how economy and culture intertwine. And I'm going to make a second apology that this outline shows a different talk than the one I advertised. This is all very much a research in progress, and thus I'm just going to say that change is inevitable. As I said, I'm going to start in an introduction, looking at some end products. I'm going to go back to a starting point. I'm going to try and give a brief review of the complicated Islamic story. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about Carolingian reform in Western Christendom. And then I want to return to the question of just the adoption of paper itself, to really unpack some of the things that I think we take for granted about technological change, and think about both economic and cultural aspects of that change. So, and here you'll note, I've discovered apparently that my handy maps of the Mediterranean are very popular. So I've decided I should put a copyright on them since I spent endless amounts of time making them. But there's a handy map of the Mediterranean. But here we're going to focus on 2 points, Alexandria and Palermo. And I'm going to start with 2 end products and that emerge from these 2 places. So in 1060 or 1061, the merchant Nahr ibn Nasim wrote this rather disgustingly messy document. And it's unusually messy for him. He's actually a fairly careful man. And I will note that it has been cataloged as an account, owing to the fact that it is in columns and that there are lines between items, but it is not one. Nahr was not this messy when he wrote accounts. It is, in fact, a list of goods, mostly either sent to Sicily or to be sent to Sicily for himself and some of his colleagues, with plans for what should happen to them when they arrive. And these are almost certainly a series of working notes he actually made when he was physically at the port of Alexandria as wares were being loaded onto ships, because the writing demonstrates a series of returns to the page, using different inks, writing different sizes and spaces, crossing things out, and corrections wherever there is space. I will also say it also has the characteristic size and shape, since I've been delving into paper, of basically Nahr's note paper, which he used for notes like this, as well as for draft, as well as for his daily ledger. And it's folded vertically into a bifolio, which is also pretty standard for this kind of document. We know it wasn't sent as part of a letter because it doesn't have the folds that would be characteristic. And we know that also sometimes such accounts and notes would be folded inside letters. Now, I will say that the instructions that Nahr is writing would seem to me to be absolutely necessary. And I'm not going to bore you with all the details of what he was doing, but you'll just in this thing, you'll see that the notes record some extremely complicated assemblage of packing that had taken place, with complicated ownerships and receiving agents, and it would have been difficult for the person sorting through the arriving cargo to figure out what it was and to whom it belonged. And here, I will also note that it might have been actually difficult for Nahr to figure it out from his notes, because this particular entry says that he has sent half of a load of carnations with Rav Yeshua, and I apologize also that there are problems with the diacritics, which comes from transferring things onto PowerPoint that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. And with those, he sent 340 rattles of yellow Meyerbaum, part of which was shipped in a bale belonging to Rav Yeshua, and part of it in a package of cinnamon. And also in the cinnamon package, there's also for my private account a small package of something. The bale was on board the Emir's boat. No, he crossed that out. It's on board the old boat that belongs to Ibn Baba. No, the package was shipped on board the Emir's vessel. It's actually not at all clear. Now, we also, and this is a rare case, know that Nahre sent many of these details to his associate in the central Mediterranean, one Yaqub ibn Ismail al-Andalusi. And indeed, it seems that the complicated information neither arrived in time nor accurately. For we have, in fact, as we rarely do, a very clean and clear letter that records what happened to many of the items on the list. And I will just note, for instance, in relation to this bale that we've talked about, after the necessary formal introduction, he launches into the nitty-gritty. Now, he says, you'd probably like to know the following. As soon as I arrived in Sicily, I asked my brother about the bales of flax which belonged to our partnership. He informed me that he had taken delivery of only 2 bales. I then asked him about the bale which had been shipped in the boat of the elder Abu Abdullah, and he said, the boat indeed arrived, but it carried no letter for me, and I did not know there was any merchandise for us in it, so I did not take delivery of anything from it. And then he goes on through a series of other problems that happened with these shipments. And so we see that just as Nahre sent bundles with complicated ownership stakes, at the other end, he relied on the actions of many agents who dealt with packages according to indications in various kinds of writing, in letters that arrived by overland courier, letters sent by sea, on labels written on packages or notes placed inside them. And there's a lot that we can say, and I have said, about the mechanics of trade and the role of writing in it from these, but I want to here just focus on the material forms of these pieces of writing and how they reflect this world of practical literacy. So I'll note that the support in both cases of paper, the language is Arabic, written in Hebrew characters. Both hands are what Geniza specialists loosely call Western, and the inks are similar. The letter is extremely neat. It is well spaced to fit the support, and characteristically contains no extraneous marks at all. The notes, on the other hand, sprawl across the page, crossing the fold, where corrections and additions need to be made, are subject to crossings and recopyings that really make one wonder if Nahre ended up sending the right information. I mean, again, which ship actually took the cinnamon? Which bales were actually on each boat? And I will say, interestingly to me, Nahre's notes actually display some of the limits and problems of paper and ink as a medium. The ink bonds with the paper and can't be erased. So it's hard to get rid of information that is no longer accurate. And we can say that an earlier technology, wax covered tablets used in Egypt in the Roman period and still at this period in use in Western Europe, are certainly a better technology for recording and editing drafts. But in this period, Nahre was stuck with paper. And I mention this because I think we often take for granted that adoption of a new technology is based on its superiority. On the other hand, I will say that the letter's presence in the Geniza seems to represent an absolute triumph of communication. It's fresh and legible after nearly 1,000 years, a trip across the Mediterranean, and unmarred by its more than 8 centuries stored in the Ben Ezra synagogue Geniza. It, to me, also represents the astonishing result of the changes that cleaved to the history of literacy, everyday literacy in the Islamic and Western Christian world. And I want to say that I think both success and failure are important parts of that story. So just to take us back very, very briefly to thinking about the extent of changes that we're talking about, to summarize, indeed. If you think about the problem of the material production of writing and paper's conquest, I want to go back to suggest that we shouldn't see this as a seamless process or misunderstand the extent of cultural and economic investment that this shift involved, and also the rather more complicated timing than I think we have been led to believe. So if we think about the world of the early medieval or early Islam or late antiquity, pick your term for this period. I'm going to say before 750, there's an enormous variety, as it turns out, of supports that are in use, both in the Islamic ecumene and in Europe. So certainly we have papyrus, we have parchment. Leather is kind of a secondary material, but there's plenty of use of it. Wooden tablets that are covered in wax, which is actually quite expensive, but an incredibly important support for someone who writes a lot. And then others with more limited geography, obviously ostraca, ceramic fragments, sticks, which we know seem to have been limited to the Arabian Peninsula. Paper was already in use, though mostly limited to the very northeast corner of Transoxiana. There's palm leaves in use, and of course, there's also bark. And equally, I think most of us know that this is a world with a very complex set of relationships between languages, registers, and genres of writing. Perhaps the most important, though I've listed some of the ones that we usually focus on, is the wide gap, actually, between the written and spoken forms of the imperial languages of Greek and Latin, and then the further ethnic and class divide that often separated speakers of these languages from other vernaculars. So, and again, I just wanted to bear that background in mind to think about the making of this revolution that produces these documents. Because encapsulated in these two pieces of essentially business ephemera is a set of interlocking changes in technology adoption, and norms of practice that determined how these documents were written, and some parts of the story that shaped Nahre's use and expectations of writing are well known, and others are less so, and some are really being rewritten at the moment. And so I think it's worth thinking about the fact that we really have to think about all of these changes to account for what's going on in this world of communication. So the process of Arabization in both oral and written communication, the spread of paper as a universal support, quite simplified norms of document production in comparison to earlier and later periods. What I've called the overproduction of literacy specialists, that is, people who are trained to write with a set of production norms. And then finally, the creation of a variety of independent commercial postal systems. And obviously, as I've already said, the results of all of this are we can get lower costs, easier entry, but also, I should note, variable information density. Now, most of us will know a story of Arabization that is traced through key literary or administrative markers. The beginnings of the use of Arabic in state documents starting in the late 7th century under Umayyad rule, the translations of the Hebrew Bible into Arabic in the 9th century that demonstrate widespread use of Arabic as a vernacular and increasing loss of access to comprehension of the Hebrew or Aramaic, and the switch from Coptic to Arabic in Coptic church records. But I think it's important to know that documentary materials provide another window. And here I'm entirely relying on the work of the Arabic papyrologists of the papyrology database, and these surveys continue to be ongoing. But I think what we really want to see is how the documentary picture really shows the process of Arabization and its written supports. That is, in the Umayyad period, we really only see a limited and really quite state-oriented Arabization. Arabic material mostly comes from state officials, that is 70% of it. The majority of the materials we find are not in Arabic. And 50% of the Coptic materials, which is the second largest corpus I mean, it's the largest corpus in this period, are also from state officials, showing that Arabic was not the only language of practical administration. And I note here my nota bene. We all know that the majority of these documents that are available are Egyptian finds, but there are also edited documents from Iraq and Greater Syria, but we really aren't looking at areas beyond that when we look at what we get from the Arabic papyrology database. But that said, I think it's important to note how radically things have shifted in the Abbasid period. That is, the absolute number of Arabic documents preserved increases 7-fold. The number of Coptic documents drops radically. Sorry, I'm having a technical issue again. And Coptic is no longer used for state administration, and the numbers of documents in other languages drops even more precipitously. Moreover, of these documents are now only on papyrus, parchment, and paper. We don't have any edited, at least, finds that are Astrakhan leather from this period. And then we can also see very much that Arabic is not only quite dominant, but that it becomes the general mode of communication. So 40% of the Arabic materials are now business and private matters. That is, the documentary corpus shows to some extent how Arabic rapidly expanded in the shift from the Umayyad to the Abbasid period, from a state language to a shared language of written communication, largely displacing all other languages for private and personal uses. And that is, it's the lingua franca for all short and long distance communication, trade and commerce, private matters, and of course, academic exchange. And it also is a language that remains surprisingly uniform throughout this period, despite the development of competing chanceries as regional powers broke away. Perhaps most important in this research, this growing research from the Arabic papyrologists, and here's, sorry, just a brief comparison of the Umayyad versus Abbasid period. And I just want to note that the most important discovery from the work of Andreas Kaplony, to whom I'm very much indebted for this overview, is what he's shown is that the Judeo-Arabic of this period in particular is not a distinct dialect of Arabic, either in language or orthography. Because Judeo-Arabic has been studied so much more thoroughly than the Arabic papyri that show the everyday practical communication, the fact that the variations that we associate with Judeo-Arabic that are distinct from normative classical Arabic of the grammarians are actually quite mirrored in Arabic script documents. The chronology and geography seems to be identical, helping support this general picture that Arabization was proceeding across religious boundaries. And equally, that changes in Arabic and Judeo-Arabic, when we can date them well, seem to go hand in hand, showing that the written Judeo-Arabic was fully dependent on local Arabics of this period, which is important because although we can think of important in two ways. First, although obviously there are modern dialects of Judeo-Arabic that are linguistically distinctive, mirroring the case of Yiddish, such differences had not yet arisen, which is one reason that some scholars have started to actually say Arabic written in Hebrew script rather than Judeo-Arabic for this period. More broadly, we also find that by the Ottoman period, the uniformity of this Abbasid production starts to drift, and we're going to find regional variations in languages, but those are both acceptable in written everyday communication, and those languages are still mutually intelligible. And obviously, the results that I want to focus on here with respect to literacy is that this does lead us first to have a broader literate culture, and that the closeness of the written and spoken languages and the drop in linguistic bounding by ethnicity, religion, and class results in much lower barriers to becoming literate in a practical sense. The second great change, of course, is the development of the uniform material culture of writing. I'm going to return to important details of this later, but the physical evidence of the Geniza and Arabic pyrite collections and coordinating evidence of administrative manuals tells us not just that paper was available most places, but that paper became a preferred support for almost every kind of writing over the course of the 10th to 12th centuries. And this is also important because, as specialists will tell you, different supports and tend to involve using different writing instruments and different inks, and they require different kinds of scripts and a development of skills for speedy and effective production. An interesting addition to these aspects of production, at least from what I know of the 10th to 12th century, is that we actually see an interesting simplification of the material text. In contrast to both earlier and later periods in our material records of everyday writing and diplomas, we have disappearance of many forms of authentication or secrecy in letters, either forms of sealing, as closing of documents, or seals that authenticate. We often lack signatures, and even the alama at this point is still mostly just a written phrase if it's used, and it's mostly only used by the chancery, and it's not always used, and it lacks the very elaborate graphical character it will redevelop later. So if we think about this letter, it is an extremely simple block. It's just a single sheet, a single block, no seals, no authentications, no reading marks by the recipient. And that it is not materially that different from the official product of the Fatimid Chancery here, the investiture for a military commander of approximately the same period. So, and perhaps the most important part of this, as a result, is that we seem to have a rather overproduction of literary specialists. That is, it doesn't seem to have been a very valuable skill, and that these societies were producing many more such specialists than there was a demand for, resulting both in lots of poor scribes and in broader access to literacy through purchase on the marketplace. And what I really want to point out here is I think that it helps remind us that societal access to and use of literacy may have very little to do with the percentage of readers and writers. And I don't have time to give you all the details of this, but I will note that you can find examples of all of these aspects of evidence for the overproduction of literacy specialists. And one of the things we note is that even a very poor woman it seems to be able to afford to, this is a scribally produced document, afford the cost of having a letter of petition produced. And equally, I'm so sorry, I'm having so many technical problems here with my screens. I'm going to skip that. And sorry. So, and one of the interesting aspects of this is that in accounts of merchants, the total costs of communication, writing, paper, ink, and postage were rarely worth charging to a partnership, or even for a traveling junior merchant to charge back to a senior merchant who was paying his expenses. Even though, as we can see, this account includes costs of twine for tying bales, costs for porters, costs for the porter's meals. And even in cases where paper is included by penny-wise partners, the total costs of paper and postal fees are insignificant. They're never more than 0.1% of transaction expenditures and often the cheapest item on the list. No one bothered to include incidental expenses for ink and pens, and we actually rarely find charges for the writing itself. The charge of the scribe writing up the contract. These costs were evidently so low that even someone who did charge the paper costs of correspondence over 2 years of an account did not include them. And here I'll note, this is one of the few cases in which we have katib, but this is probably the payment to a government clerk. So we want to also be careful about ascribing to writing costs that are costs of bureaucracy. And so what we have is that we want to think about is that all of these linguistic, material, and cultural shifts come together to spur increases in production of documents and demands for their circulation, resulting in this proliferation of private overland postal systems. And if you've read your Goetine or me, you'll know that there's several different roots of them. But really, what I want to what is interesting is that there were low-cost carriers who operated standard routes on either fixed or fairly fixed schedules and routes, and that in some cases, like the area of Egypt and Greater Syria, it could sustain weekly overland service all year. At such a low cost and predictability that traveling merchants would actually sometimes wait for responses to queries about the disposition of goods rather than making the best of unusual situations. It also suggests a large enough volume of mail to support this. And again, historically, this is actually very unusual. Most postal systems historically are state operated or state subsidized. It's possible that there were subsidies for this, but there's no evidence that there were. And so there has to be enough demand and infrastructure and expectations to support the work involved. So it suggests an enormous amount of common use of literacy. And so what we see is, as I mentioned at the beginning, that it ends up costing between 0.5 and 1.5 dirhams to have a letter actually hand delivered by a single private courier who traveled overland halfway across the Mediterranean from Alexandria to Kairouan or even Alexandria to Sicily. And though that does not compare to modern state-supported postage costs, this is less than a day's wages for a laborer like a porter. It's half the cost of a chicken dinner, which admittedly was a fancy meal back then. And it doesn't rise higher than this, even when violence and political instability in the area between Egypt and Tunisia was so extensive that regular caravan traffic ceased in the later decades of the 11th century. And of course, this leads to a situation in which a mother could use very cheap paper, admittedly, to send a letter simply complaining of her son's absence from Raqqa to Egypt and mentioning that she missed them so much that even their dirty shirts sent home, she could refresh her spirit with the smell. And also, of course, made it worthwhile and possible for poor illiterate widows or artisans to send letters of petition requesting aid not only across Cairo, but around Egypt and occasionally from Syria or even farther. Okay. Okay, and what I want to point out in thinking about comparing these changes is that I think we often think of we take the European situation for granted, or as a natural outcome. But recent work, especially by my colleagues Adam Costo and Warren Brown, has really explored the use of writing by the laity in early medieval Europe and showed that not just in the Islamic world, but before 750 in Europe, we also see a fair bit of writing in lay contexts and using all of these supports. And so this is not just Roman practice, but early medieval practice. And that we really want to think of what's happening in the Carolingian period as, just like the Abbasid period, a period of cultural consolidation around the practices and norms of writing. And Europeanists will know that enormous resources are getting pushed into literate culture, the creation with the urge to create a uniform liturgy, the production of books to support shared liturgical practice. Also, in the Carolingian libraries, we see the creation of dictionaries and compendias of quotation and the production of formularies. There's the creation and investment in institutions for learning. And equally, there is a move to the universal support of parchment for permanent documents, with wax tablets continuing in use for ephemeral writing. And of course, also the creation of a new standardized script, which, as European historians always delight in explaining to their students, to whom such writing looks much, much clearer and neater than later medieval scripts, that this is actually the much more time-consuming and difficult script to produce with the available tools. And so one of the things that we see, or that they argue, is that the other thing that's happening is that there is very much a restriction in this same period of literate personnel. Literacy becomes the at least theoretical preserve of clerics and the religious. And we see this, that not only are the religious taking more and more, that literacy is becoming more associated with the religious class, but even that they're the creation of formularies and monasteries for lay contracts, and that religious personnel are serving the literacy needs of the laity. And thus we really see not a just happenstance, but the creation of a culture in which writing is a prestigious skill, has limited practitioners, is in a learned and non-vernacular language, and that this is not mere chance, but people were actively inventing a more exclusive and also more valuable kind of literacy. So finally, this leads me back to this problem of the materials of writing in the Islamic world. And I think what sometimes we assume about the cultural and economic forces that are at play in the adoption of a single writing support. So first, I have to start off with a sad truth, which is that the history of the material practices of Islamic writing is very understudied. Islamic writing as a the cultural products of Islamic writing are not understudied, but the use of supports and inks, the composition of supports that are used, what are the kinds of paper, the diplomatics, the norms of document production, these are all things that have only started to be studied very seriously in the last couple of decades. And so I will say that this research participates in very much an ongoing conversation, and that what I will tell of this story will change. Because the old story, that is the story I told maybe 2 years ago, has to be revised. As many of you will know, the idea that the Islamic world gets its paper from China has to be revised. But also we are seeing that, yes, the Abbasids do adopt paper and its use spreads quickly across their realm, quickly replacing all other supports, except for ritual purposes, is the story that we're normally told. That is, in the Eastern heartlands, this transformation happens in the 8th and 9th centuries. Across the Islamic Mediterranean in the 9th and 10th centuries, papyrus production essentially ceases in the 9th century after thousands of years of use in Egypt. therefore leading to the notion that functionally paper must be vastly superior in some way. Equally, that all Islamic paper is the same, it's a unitary technology, all using linen rag, all needing burnished paper, and that Mediterranean production actually soon outpaces Iran and Iraq. And from this, we get the very famous story from the traveler Nasser Khusro, who travels from Persia to the Mediterranean in the 11th century. And one of the marvels that he notes of Cairo is that paper is so available that when you go shopping, purchases are wrapped in paper. That is, you don't need to bring your own bags. But I will note that one of the problems with this narrative is that our sources are mostly narrative or administrative manuals or from surviving books to look at this kind of production. And of course, that I'm going to skip and turn again to the documents. And if we want to revise the story of paper and of all of these supports as we move from the Umayyad to Abbasid period, yes, we do see the disappearance of ostraca and leather in Egypt and Syria. And for my purposes, this is actually very significant. By the 9th century, we see the disappearance of papyrus everywhere. State documents of all kinds are on paper, and of course, codices are on paper. But an important recent examination with a focus on the material texts shows the ways in which parchment actually continued to be used in Egypt and Syria. Eve Krakowski is currently working on rabbinical quartz, and preliminarily, she has been finding that parchment continues to be the exclusive material in rabbinic quartz in the 9th and part of the 10th century. It's not until the late 10th century that we see a switch to paper in Syria, and in Egypt, a switch to paper in the early 11th centuries. And I have noted that this dovetails neatly with some of the recent additions of caches of documents from the Fayoum from the 9th and the 11th centuries, in which we find when we have groups of family papers that state documents, which include mostly tax receipts and quittances, are all on paper. All the correspondence is on paper, but all of the private contracts are on parchment until 1028, which is not a particularly important year. It just happens to be a dated document in the caches I've looked at. Man, my time is running short. So I will note, in addition, that very quickly, that very importantly, in the central Mediterranean, mostly in the early 11th century, parchment is also used. It is also used for most of the materials that we have, and for most merchant purposes. And then again, we have a very rapid abandonment around the period between 1035 and 1050 of parchment by merchants in the central Mediterranean. And I will also note that the very last document that we get on parchment is a rather hideous example. And one conclusion that you might take from the fact that parchment is still being used for legal materials was that it was prestige support, and that the switch to paper was perhaps part of lowering costs for the court as paper spreads. But this does not seem to be the case. First, because I think we think of parchment as a prestige support because we're used to it surviving in prestige objects. But I promise you, an examination of parchment used by merchants shows you that, in fact, they are using pretty hideous, low-quality parchment, and that paper was, in fact, already the more prestigious support. That is, if we look at particular, that when we see in the early 11th century, when people are using paper, they're using it for their more prestigious writing, to people who are more important, generally to people who are more important, or particularly to people in Egypt who might have these expectations. And I will note that I gave the image that I presented of my document is particularly ugly because this was an attempt, a very early attempt by a merchant in Kairouan to send a more polite paper letter to a senior merchant in Egypt. And we can see this problem. Parchment and paper don't use the same types of ink. And if you use gall ink on paper, you're likely to get what is called, what this is, ink burn. That is, it bites right through. Okay, so I have to, yes, getting to a couple of important points. When we think about the quick and slow adoption and abandonment, the quick abandonment of papyrus and the rather slower pace of movement of paper, we often, again, have this received wisdom that I have been guilty of spreading, that paper is cheaper, possibly much cheaper to produce, and that parchment is more expensive but more durable. And we forget that we don't have information really on prices and that many grades of both exist. And what I really want to focus on is when I think about the abandonment of papyrus, I think it's important really to see it much more in the economic context of a regional economy. That is, papyrus is a perfectly good writing material, but it also is produced from a single-use field crop. And whereas paper is largely produced from rags, that is recycled textiles, with the addition of the waste fibers from plants that produce both textile fibers and oils. And so I think when we look at the very rapid abandonment of papyrus, we might think of the cultural factors of prestige, but also that there is a question of the use of agricultural land and labor, and that agricultural land is in demand because of the massive growth of textile production in the Islamic world, and that paper can then be an add-on to the world of textiles. It's a last use for textiles, and in fact, better quality paper is produced from very worn rags because paper needs to be broken down. And I think one of the things I'm most interested in exploring is medieval preferences for manufactured, reusable consumer products. As usual, I have not gotten to everything that I wanted to get to. So, I will just note, therefore, that when we think about the delay in the shift of paper in the 11th century of East, one of the things we might think about is the conservatism of legal practice, partially because property contracts, as a practical example, were often, when they're written, when you make transfers, you often use the same initial piece of paper and use its other side, therefore creating sort of a temporal gap with the use of the support that you're used to. And we might think in terms of shifting in Jewish courts, rather than shifting to both paper, rather than the shift of paper and Arabic being a cheapening or popularization, it might actually have to do more with the fact that this is increasingly the material of prestige and Arabic is increasingly the language of prestige. And finally, I will note that after these final shifts in the East to paper for most uses, that's when we see this very rapid shift in the central Mediterranean that seems to have almost nothing to do with the economics. In fact, as I note, if anything, the economics of getting paper are worse in the mid-11th century. For practical reasons, paper is normally shipped over land because paper and water are not friends, and Islamic shipping does not assure at all that things stay dry, and that what we probably see is much more cultural pressure that leads to the adoption of paper. That is, as the center of economic and legal culture in the Islamic Mediterranean shifts to Cairo, and it is more a source and user of paper. These push people in the central Mediterranean to using something that is in fact more expensive and less available to them. And so I note that the other reason I started off with Nahre's document is that it is the only, in this incredibly messy little piece of paper right here, it is the only shipment of paper by sea that I've seen yet, but responds to a new culturally created demand. And so what I want to take away from this is that changes in cultures of everyday writing don't have a single causality. That technology is not necessarily driver, nor economy, nor function, nor functionality, nor prestige. And that shifts, all of these shifts involve series of changes with active cultural and economic agents. Equally, when we look at rates of literacy and we really think about how literacy is being used in the Islamic world, it's fairly meaningless, and it presumes modern and Western values, the values for this set of skills. What's more important is access to literacy and practices. When was literacy necessary? When was it imposed on people? How does it come to be desired? And also, finally, that economic objects can be far more complicated and culturally driven than economic historians like to suppose, just as cultural preferences like modest dress, which in some ways lies behind paper, depend on economic conditions, thus just as they can drive a further cascade of economic change. Thanks so much.